Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back in bringing you a special video today. I've got a great interview that I was able to conduct when I was way at Blizzcon, in addition to dyeing my hair, with Sigma, also known as Jay, from the WoW development team, specifically focusing on class design, class balance, things like that. And for those of you Dispriests, of course, you'll see that Sigma was the developer who had a lot of input and a lot of conversations with the community, really, when the 7.2.5 disc revamps were running. So it was awesome to just be able to kind of get his thoughts and probe his thoughts on, some more broad questions about how they go about designing specs and how they go about, solving some of the problems that can kind of arise from balancing 30 some odd specs in the game for player versus environment gameplay, right? So we got to talk a little bit about the Mythic Dungeon Invitational and just some of their challenges going forward as we see Battle for Azeroth. It is an audio-only interview, so there'll be some clips and stuff like that from my most previous raid. But yeah, hope you guys enjoy it. Let me know if you guys got any kind of questions and feedback and stuff like that, like what you'd like to see, if I can try to get some future interviews conducted. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. Hope you all enjoy it. I'll catch y'all next time.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm joined here today with Jay, also known as Sigma, for the WoW development team.
Hi, everyone.
Today I wanted to go over just a couple of questions that I and some others in the community had more about how you guys are going about the process of your class balancing as we're entering, the last tier of Legion here. And starting it off, I kind of want to see if we could get like a post-mortem on some of the spec reboots of this expansion. We've seen, a number of classes where there was a big focus on mixing and synergizing class fantasy, but also keeping, some much-needed tune-ups for a number of different specs. We saw it with Discipline, and we saw it a couple times with Discipline. Outlaw, Survival. What was the general thoughts on how you approach first designing these new specs almost from scratch, while also keeping the class fantasy to it?
Yeah, Legion was definitely, the whole Legion project was defined by, we did some measure of big update to almost every spec. And overall, I think it went well in that we found most of the specs players are happy with them. Players are getting good feedback, response. It's whenever we change that many things, we sort of would be lying to ourselves if we didn't say there'll be a few that we'll hope we could revisit going forward, especially on essentially 36 almost new rotations. And it wound up being that our project since then has been one by one targeting the ones where we really want to do updates. And I think the ones that we've updated in 7.1.5, 7.2.5, and 7.3 have gone really well. Feral, Frost, and Disc have all gone through that process and been at the point where I think people are a lot happier with them now.
I can definitely say that from experience. I'm a lot more happy with Discipline now, or it feels a lot more interactive, and you feel like you have a lot more control over what's happening there.
Excellent, yeah, and we can definitely talk about that too. But on the overall point, I think we see our project now as which are other specs like that we want to identify for targets, for targeted further iterations, and probably not anytime soon we want to go and reevaluate everything on most specs again. Because in a lot of ways, I think we were successful in doing a lot of the things we wanted to do, more uniqueness on specs that didn't have enough differentiation from each other, more strong identity and core on specs that didn't have a clear purpose on what was driving their rotation before. And a lot of it was simply when you make that much change at once, it takes a long time to settle down. I mean, 7.1.5, maybe 50% of the specs again saw pretty significant changes. 7.2.5, probably half of that again. And that's an inevitable part of the process. And we're at a point now on more of a 7.3 and 7.3.2 time frame where stability is getting more important as we've been longer and longer in an expansion, and there are fewer and fewer specs where we really want to go in and overhaul everything again.
Yes, and so you're talking about making sure that you're not going to be flipping the table and everything like that. Going forward, how do you judge keeping stability while also making larger meta changes? So one thing we've seen with healers expansion to expansion is their role with absorbs, bringing those down, but also a healer tank relationship. Can you talk a bit about how you're kind of have managed almost invincible tanks in Mist of Pandaria to tanks needing tons of healing early WAD, and now the revised version of Legion? How do you speak to keeping the balance in check while also being able to make larger meta shifts like that?
So tanks requiring some amount of external healing is something we generally want to have among other important reasons, because it's meant to be a part of healer gameplay. And I think what you're getting at is there have been some expansions now where it was not as big a part of a healer gameplay as it could have been, where general raid healing wound up being more important and tanks were largely sustaining themselves. So the toughest balance to find there is tanks feeling empowered to have control over their own survivability and good use of their abilities, controlling, what separates a good tank from a bad tank, whether they're surviving important things, but still healers gameplay also being split between when do I have to heal the tank, when do I have to heal the raid. It gets all the more interesting with solo healing content, dungeons being brought back up to the forefront again. And a classic part of solo healing content way back in the old days was, I have to use this cast time heal on the tank right now, intention in my head, with I have to use my AoE heal on the group. And I think that's something we want to maintain.
And when we're talking about solo healing, that kind of is a good transition into the Mythic Dungeon Invitational. I mean, we've seen a huge swath of different classes that were represented in the first event. Going forward, though, what do you see as some of the plans? Starting off with healers, and we can kind of talk about DPS and tanks for a little bit later. Where do you see the role of, what you would like all healers to be able to do to accomplish there, but also not homogenizing them?
Mythic Dungeons becoming such a huge point of focus in the game, this expansion is, first of all, it's something we love. I mean, as a team generally, because it's been such a successful aspect of the game, and then also on classes in particular, it's a sort of gameplay where you really get to call out the uniqueness of your spec and use your different utility buttons more than you do other kind of content. So I would say the biggest thing we saw in MDI was utility becoming a big focus of balance, probably more than it had been in raids among healers for an expansion or two. And that would probably be the thing we'd want to look at most after seeing MDI metas and just even outside healers class distributions. It already forced us to make changes with things like Rebirth, where we knew they were powerful, but for many years it was not disrupting any part of the game. And the thing, on one side is balance, and on another side is we like classes having unique and powerful abilities. And so basically the question is more, what should a balanced utility package look like? What should the strengths and weaknesses be? What should the things be that some classes can handle that other classes can't handle, as more of a focus going forward?
And I think an interesting thing is definitely the utility, but how do you feel about the differences in survivability? We've seen, throughout the Dungeon Invitational, not just healers, but also, certain DPS classes, certain tank classes even, who were, because of how high, the damage could scale into these dungeons, not having the same HP pools for a prot paladin compared to a bear made a big difference, where you have to have the uniqueness to it, you have to have the differences, and you can't have every single tank with the same amount of HP. But how do you, look at balancing those specific kind of points out in terms of making a more flexible dungeon environment?
It's another thing that probably got called out a lot by the MDI, a specific sort of balance that survivability overall, broadly speaking, generally has to be balanced enough that, you're not trying to do a piece of content and you feel like there's a class you can't bring. Really high-level mythics focus a lot of attention onto a very specific kind of spike survival, where something like a Nightmare Bolt is coming and, up to maybe a 15, which is as high as we reward Mythic Plus, any class can do it. But when you start trying to do 17 and 18, someone's going to be the first who starts getting one-shot by an ability like that. And again, there's a balance. On some level, no matter what we do, there's going to be that world where if you're trying to push up to a 21 and other people are doing a 20, someone's going to have the most effective HP against a particular ability. But the flip side is, it does make us want to balance that kind of survivability a little more independently of other things. Something I was sort of getting at before is we do want to spread out class strengths and weaknesses more. There is a limit to it, because we can't have a class with all its balanced chips in survivability and none in other kind of utility, because you get into that kind of problems where then in a particular piece of content you feel like there's only one class who can do it. So I think we do want to spread out and balance utility as a goal for the future. The focus there is more uniqueness than anything else. Utility kind of takes care of itself in a nice way if we ensure that every class handles a different subset of things nicely and has something that they can do better than other people. And similarly with survivability, everyone should feel like they have some tool they can use to help themselves survive. and making those distinct and independently powerful is more of the goal.
Understandable. One thing I'm interested in is, you're talking about how they would like to have a good spread of different abilities, of different utilities that they can bring to things. But how does that also work, and how does the balance team, for example, work on creating a balanced environment for the specific instances that we're running? We've seen it a lot with just dungeons and stuff like that, where you're seeing, how do we balance? I mean, I remember one thing in Mr. Pandaria where combat rogues got extra cleave on Garelon's legs, and that had to be patched right away because that was something that was insane. But going into like dungeons, making unique abilities. I know, for example, as a Disc Priest, I'll have many times where I'm like, well, I wish Mass Dispel was more useful here. I have a couple niche situations, a couple boss fights where it's amazing, but it's not something where you're able to have and you're not something where you're having the extra survivability, or you're not having a rebirth. How does it balancing the content with balance changes itself?
The best thing we can do there on both the content and the class side is have as much variety as we can. Something like you described on Mass Dispel is an example of something that works well if in an entire array of dungeons there are a few points where it pops up as you get to handle something more easily than everyone else. And then there are other bosses where you don't have the thing, like Leg Sweep or something, where someone else feels like they bring an extremely powerful tool which lets them help their group handle a particular moment more easily than they would have if you were in the group. And the more we present a really broad spread of different threats that different classes can answer in different ways, the more successful we are on a goal of not just balance, but having different comps experience a dungeon in different ways is something we want to get more of.
And we also saw, with both rating and with Mythic Dungeon content, the big spread of legendaries and how those all kind of come into balance. What are some of the thoughts when you're first designing new legendaries? Because we've seen, give or take, about every major patch we're getting a new legendary or two. How are you making them also unique to each spec, while also trying to balance out the different power levels that can kind of come with it?
A lot of it is starting with when we're, like you described later in a expansion cycle, we're adding new ones in a patch. The biggest thing is what are major abilities on this spec that don't have a legendary on them yet, where there might be some player who says, they like that ability already, they think it feels good, and it would just dovetail with what they like about the spec really well if that ability did something additionally awesome. That's the main place where we start. It's really what's the impact of the item, what's the emotional impact of the item, what's going to be fun about using it.
Do you think that it's worked well having, big focus on some large HPS, DPS increases with legendaries, whereas some have, very high utility benefits where you'll see some people switching them around a lot? Do you think that's a good mix of legendaries across the board, or would you be interested in seeing something more of, just utility or just DPS, HPS increases?
Definitely something we learned during the expansion was closing that gap a little bit. I think the place where we have legendaries now, where they all give a reasonably balanced amount of throughput, is probably something we like better than when we had some ones that only gave utility at the start, because there was a much starker difference where someone got something that gave a throughput bump and you wanted that, and you got something that gave you a small strategic benefit in some situation. Now they all give you a meaningful throughput benefit over not having a legendary. And so I think that is a place that we like them better. It's more akin to talents, where we tend not to pit throughput and utility benefits against each other very often at all. Utility legendaries now give you that moment of, I get to do something cool with Gateway or whatever button it is that has a utility legendary focused on it. But in all the other 90% of situations, you're still feeling good about wearing the legendary, and that's a better place to be.
When you're talking about talents, talents and artifact traits have had this really nice synergy this expansion where, when you're unlocking that extra gold trait, and being able to have that, bonus synergy that can go on there. I know, I love the Holy Priest where you're able to have Renew the Faith, where you're having all your prayer of mendings, bouncing around for free, but you're able to have a very good synergy with that, through your artifact trait, or through your talents rather, that you're getting more of them out in general. So you're having, this good little mix that you're able to build up there. How do you see artifact traits, especially some of the more popular ones, you see some of those going forward being more integrated, into talents, and how do you see, some of the talents builds that we've had this expansion, especially for the reboots, how successful those have been?
It's not something decided yet as far as artifact traits, but overall, yeah, talents are a space that we may well iterate on nearly any spec, because even the specs that we're very happy with after an expansion worth of just seeing how they played out and data and feedback, we'd be able to identify the talents we want to replace. And yeah, there are a lot of good ideas floating around to pull new talents from. Definitely nothing more decided than that, but
definitely be something on the radar going forward.
yeah.
Awesome. Glad to hear it. And an interesting thing that's kind of come about with the Netherlight Crucible is something kind of like what's been explained, over the course of many expansions of power creep. And we see that, not only was it affecting DPSers, certain ramp-up classes. I know Shadow Priest loved to talk about this one, of, early on in a raid tier, they're doing extremely well. Mobs live a long time, allowing them to dot things up. We also see it on the other side with healers, where healers that have, more hot-based healing and have a greater share of that steadily. And it used to be absorbs that they were, more losing out to, but now we're seeing, burst healing becoming more and more effective with the power of things like revival, Light's Wrath, or sacrifice for paladins. How do you see that power creep going forward into Antorus, and how you're able to better manage, the Netherlight Crucible benefits, and depending on how long the tier might be, keeping content interesting over a long period of time there?
Yeah, it's definitely, you identified a pretty classic problem on healers, which is the pace of healing gameplay becoming faster and faster as an expansion goes on. It's something we've definitely been familiar with from some past expansions. And we anticipated in Legion, especially with the advent of artifacts, because they were adding such a large power increase to players over the course of an expansion compared to what we had before. So there was a definite worry that there would be a world where we balance and tune and pace healing to feel really good near the start of an expansion, as far as how quickly it takes to top someone off and those kinds of questions. And then would artifacts come along and get you into a very spammy world? And that's why, for example, we have the passive health increase on all artifacts. It's designed to make the healing environment stay pretty stable and let you heal even as you get more powerful into a set of players with larger health pools who are taking more damage that stays balanced against the amount of healing that you're doing. And all in all, I think that went pretty well. I don't think we have right now a repeat of what you might remember from the End of Wrath, End of Kata, those kinds of expansions.
Even the End of Mop in some encounters. I remember, for example, the difference between 10 and 25-man healing of Siege Raptor Blackfuse. If I had to run out my laser as a healer and we're two healing the fight, it's something that people are not 100% topped off, you have tons and tons of issues there. So I definitely, and I think many of us have definitely seen as healers, definitely moving away from the more toxic elements of shields or ridiculously heavy burst damage at the end of raid tiers and things like that. But I think it's an interesting thing to look at, how effective burst healing has become on specific fights. We've seen some experimentation. This is more than counter design of like Thorns elements, or shortcuts that cause you to take lots more damage and can sort of counter some of the issues that you would have of, the healing starts getting boring after this point. Do you see, more things like that going forward as being healthier for gameplay?
Those are cool designs, so I'm happy when I see them experimenting with stuff like that, because they lead to fun encounters, they lead to encounters that don't have the issues you describe. I would say from our perspective, there was also the focus on fixing it on more of a broad tuning level, so it's not like every encounter has to come up with its own solution to not making healing overly spammy. So things like just tuning the health pool of players is honestly the most important tool, and making it so that when you get much more powerful healing capability over the course of an expansion through artifacts and anything else, that you feel like you have content available to you that have players with large amounts of health commensurate with that, taking damage commensurate with that, rather than the world where you're being threatened by increasing spike damage and going faster and faster. It's basically something that we've definitely seen in the past and are trying to find the correct balance for now.
Gotcha. And the thing about raid cooldowns, I talked about it from the burst element, but also we've seen a big scale down in the effectiveness of raid cooldowns, from taking DPSers' abilities to have raid cooldowns away, just across the board, but also seeing a huge just drop down in the effectiveness of all healers' raid cooldowns. And how do you see that going forward? Do you think more might need to be done to make it so that you're not just bringing healers to be able to heal through a specific mechanic, and that it's also about the skill of the healers in between those? Or do you think they're in a good spot now?
I think there was a lot of progress made towards that in Legion. Like you said, we cut down the power of all the main throughput cooldowns in Legion Beta. We wound up bringing that back up again partway, so it wasn't a drastic reduction, but I think we're pretty happy with where they wound up. We've not gotten huge feedback one way or another since the beta about they're too strong, they're too weak. I think people find that they perform their intended purpose really well. It's no longer the world where you press a tranquility and it immediately slams the raid up to full. But if someone presses one, over those 6 to 8 seconds of channeling and everyone else using their AoE heals, the raid gets topped off pretty rapidly and you absolutely felt like it helped you catch up. So I think they're effective, but it's not the world where they are totally negating the gameplay that everyone's supposed to have.
I remember in Warlords, actually, with Blackrock Foundry, the Blast Furnace fight, because that was such a long encounter, I think it was 11 to 13 minutes or something like that, we had, our druid would be able to trank, and then 2 or 3 people would be able to lay Torrent Potion, because it was just that powerful, right? And so it's good to see that, they're not at that kind of power level, but it would be interesting to see going forward, if there is additional feedback on, I think it'd be very difficult to take away raid cooldowns entirely, but I'd be interested in seeing, what your thoughts might be on a world where, you are not having that and it's focused on, more small throughput increases, like a Paladin's Wings or, Tree Form for Druids or things like that come in instead of the one button that tops people off.
I think we do agree that a healer environment of steady damage coming from encounters is really healthy, and it's something we've tried to do this expansion and we'll keep trying to do. The 3 minutes you spend in between casting Hymn or Tide should still be an important part of the game of their steady damage, at least a reasonably high percentage of unavoidable damage, as just part of the gameplay that healers experience, and how they manage that, how efficient are they at it, how well are they aware of the potential spikes that exist even in that damage. That's been done on a lot of encounters this expansion, and it's something we want to maintain.
Excellent. Last couple of questions I have for you. You've been a part of Blizzard's team for about, what, a year and a half now?
2 years.
2 years now. And many people will know you as Hamlet, who did a lot of WoW theory crafting, outside of the Blizzard development team. How is it for you personally, going from, having this as a fan, just being such a big fan of the game, doing this as your passion, to doing this as a job?
Of course, that was fantastic to start, because you pretty much described how I did get into it. It was something I spent all my free time on, analyzing the game and blogging about it and doing math work and stuff before I applied. And I like it a lot, probably unsurprisingly. It was something I'd always wanted to do. And it definitely, I've learned a lot about what goes into making the classes fun, probably beyond just the slice of it that I made into my hobby project before I was here and before I could spend a huge amount of time on it. So doing the math work and things like that I was known for blogging about is still part of my job, but there's just a lot of analyzing what makes classes fun on a design level, a lot of impact and timing of buttons, visuals, what makes a talent row a cool decision, and learning about all that over the course of a few years has been super rewarding.
But you still have not gone to the Celeste Salon, is that right? Is that correct?
That's right. He has tried to get me to a bunch of times, but I think he's doing pretty well for himself from the looks of it this year.
That's right. I might be going a little bit later today myself. We'll
Excellent.
See. But thank you so much, Sigma, for sitting down and talking with us. It was a pleasure to have you on, and definitely wanted to thank Jay Cartier, of course, from the community team for helping us get all this together. And if you guys ever have any kind of feedback and things like that, the best way is going to be on the forums, especially as we're going to be going to Antorus and the next expansion of what we might want to be seeing in the future. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And like you said, give your feedback anywhere. We're always happy to listen to it.